Hi, I'm Roberta Layton, best known for Stripes, the movie with Bill Murray, and currently known as being the ringmaster at the wonderful Sheets Goldstein residence in Los Angeles. And you are listening to U.S. Modernist Radio.
Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Mama don't allow no architecture around here. Oh, I don't care what Mama don't allow, gonna draw mine modern anyhow. Mama don't allow no architecture around here.
Welcome to U.S. Modernist Radio, where we talk and laugh with people who enjoy, own, create, dream about, preserve, love, and hate modernist architecture, the most exciting and controversial buildings in the world.
This is the third year U.S. Modernist Radio has been part of the Architecture and Design Film Festival in New York City. Every fall, the stars, producers, and creators gather to premiere the latest documentaries, visually wonderful, thought-provoking, and faithfully documented films that capture the brilliance of their architects, artists, and significant buildings. You know you're getting to be a New Yorker when you start to run into people you know on the subway. And this recently happened between me and the executive director of the ADFF, Kyle Bergman. This year's festival featured an opening night premiere of The New Bauhaus, a film about Laszlo Moholy-Nagy and his attempt to bring the German Bauhaus tradition to America, an effort that would eventually become IIT in Chicago. I talked with producer Alysa Nahmias from inside one of the theaters, and later with Akira Boch, whose film Master of Modern Design tells the story of 5 second-generation Japanese Americans, Ruth Asawa, George Nakashima, Isamu Noguchi, Gyo Obata, and S. Neil Fujita, following the ways in which their U.S. government-run World War II internment camp experiences impacted their lives. Support for U.S. Modernist Radio comes from Nichiha.com/US Modernist and Modernist realtor Angela Roll.
Beauty, love, durability, designed to last for years to come, bringing you peace and tranquility. You feel relaxed, knowing your house can easily achieve any exterior look and any color. Wood, concrete. Your house loves feeling this good. And you love feeling this good. Nichiha, 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 Nichiha. Say it with me. Nichiha. Advanced engineering. Nichiha, Nichiha. Durability, textures, finishes, and colors. Visit Nichiha.com/US Modernist. Nichiha, Nichiha, Nichiha. That's N-I-C-H. Wait for it. A look you'll love. Nichiha. Alysa Nahmias' debut documentary, Unfinished Spaces, won a 2012 Spirit Award and is in the permanent collection at the Museum of Modern Art. Her latest film is The New Bauhaus, chronicling the life of Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, a man ahead of his time and increasingly recognized in today's discussions of art and architecture. The New Bauhaus shares his vision and perseverance to create and sustain a holistic art school in Chicago, one that's caught between the opposing tensions of ideas and commerce, tradition and experimentation, and past and present. In other words, how do you inspire people and also pay the bills? We go now to George and Alysa inside the very dark Cinepolis Theater in New York.
I've read and studied a lot of these utopian-type artistic communities that pop up. Some of them pop up like the Bauhaus in Germany, the New Bauhaus in Chicago, Black Mountain in North Carolina, and several others. And generally, they don't make it but the new Bauhaus kind of made it. I mean, it kind of lasted much longer and morphed into something that's still with us, right?
Correct.
So tell us about the overarching history of this group and where it is today.
So maybe I'll work backwards a little bit in terms of where I found the story, which is by seeing that there was going to be an exhibition, a large-scale retrospective exhibition of Moholy-Nagy's work at the Guggenheim Museum, the Art Institute of Chicago, and the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. The new Bauhaus began in 1937 in Chicago when the Association of Arts and Industries in Chicago, which was an association of wealthy industrial magnates, including Walter Pepke of Container Corporation and others, they were looking at the German Bauhaus and thought, we should get something like this going in Chicago, where artists are educating a new generation of designers who can work in tandem with industry to create objects and products that people can use. And so they gave a call to Walter Gropius, or probably wrote a letter to Walter Gropius, who was the founder of the Bauhaus in Germany.
They didn't Instagram him, I guess. No.
Exactly, no. It was not a Facebook Messenger. Probably, telegram, letter, whatever it was. And Gropius had just accepted a position at Harvard University at the Graduate School of Design. And he said, it sounds wonderful, but I can't do it. You should call my friend Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. So they did. They contacted Moholy, and Moholy said at the time he was living in London. He had already left Germany because of as the Nazis were gaining power, it was impossible for him to work there, given the kind of art he was making and also being a Jewish man. And so he accepted the position in Chicago and brought his wife and 2 young daughters to Chicago to start the new school. The school at first was really exciting. They didn't have a lot of money, but they had a mansion donated by Marshall Field.
Wow.
In which the school
that's a
was
big
housed.
Donation.
It was a huge donation, but he was invested in this whole enterprise of the school, Marshall Field. But at the end of that first year, the industrialists pulled their funding. When Moholy had not instantly delivered on products, sellable products and designers who were going to get jobs. Rather, Moholy had spent the year teaching Bauhausian curriculum of, material experimentation. And so Moholy took about a half a year off, and he ended up deciding that he would restart the school on his own. And he convinced one of the industrialists in particular, Walter Pepke of Container Corporation, to underwrite the school again. So it reopened not as the new Bauhaus, but as the School of Design in Chicago. And part of that adaptation had to do with Moholy's ability to self-invent and reinvent. He had named himself. Moholy-Nagy was not. He was born Laszlo Weiss. He had invented his last name. He was adapting because the German word Bauhaus was not a good look, to say the least. So he called the School of Design, but it was still the Bauhausian curriculum. And that school then, several years later, was joined with the Illinois Institute of Technology and was renamed the Institute of Design just prior to that. So the Institute of Design is alive and well today at IIT, and in fact has been very supportive of our film project and of Moholy's legacy recently. Over the years, the school went through many, sheddings of skin and new identities. And today it's the kinds of work that the students and graduates are doing are different than they were in the 30s, 40s, and even 50s, 60s. But the sort of spirit of wanting to integrate art and technology, work to some extent in tandem with industry, are still very much there.
Well, one of the fascinating things of the film, which I watched and really liked, was I had no idea that the Nazis had put on this really killer modernist show. Tell us about that.
Well, killer is probably the right word for it, in that,
it was huge and very, very comprehensive, but it was not for the purpose of elevating this stuff.
Exactly. So the Degenerate art show, which was put on by the Nazis, was intended to exhibit degenerate art that was unacceptable, not, in line with what the Nazis thought was pure and acceptable. It was primarily abstract art. Moholy-Nagy's work was included among, many others in that show. Moholy had actually just left Europe when his work was shown in that show. And yeah, I think killer is the right word, because it's joked, as the scholar Oliver Botar says in our film, that it was probably the greatest modernist art exhibition ever in terms of the kinds of work that was on the wall. But it was also a death siren, quite literally, for some of those artists, and caused them to have to leave. Although, ironically, and I think really powerfully, much like blowing a dandelion or something like that, the fact that those artists had to flee and be in exile, the ones that could escape, allowed the ideas of modernism and the Bauhaus as well to take root in other places.
I guess the Nazis were into old masters, that kind of representational art.
Well, I'm no expert on what the Nazis were into aesthetically, but I do know that the abstract art was considered dangerous because abstract art was about changing perception. Changing the way you see the world and thinking for yourself and expressing yourself. Whereas the kind of realism that the Nazis wanted to sort of espouse was benign in their opinion.
Yes, and many notches down, very similar to in the 60s, where you had the psychedelic kind of art that was seen as very dangerous, with all these hippies running around causing problems with the Vietnam War that we were supposed to be fighting. I mean, that was a similar kind of incident going on.
Totally. I mean, culture is one of the first things to be attacked by powers that be, because it actually is powerful. To be able to make a work of art that changes the way someone thinks, and which is not necessarily comprehensible or could be cryptically, have some kind of cryptic message in it, is something that I think gives art a kind of power that is perceived often as dangerous by people in power.
And also sometimes we don't perceive it at all. We don't really realize where this design comes from. It just appears to us, like the IBM Selectric typewriter, and how great that was, and that little ball in the middle that would type those things back in the 60s. And then we have iPhones now, and as general public, I mean, I'm sure designers think about this, of course, but as general public, it's just like, wow, design showed up. Mm-hmm. But there's all kinds of history behind it. And what's great about the film to me is that you really showed some of the evolution of the thought of design and how influential Moholy-Nagy was into this.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is remarkable to be able to sort of get into the process and evolution of how something, for example, as ubiquitous as the Dove soap bar was designed actually
through Bauhaus
everybody
knows
principles.
The Dove soap bar. Right?
Exactly. You can imagine it in your mind's eye, the tactile quality, and that originates from these hand sculptures that they did at the new Bauhaus in Chicago to design, and they were actually designing for blind people. So that the Bauhaus assignment with the hand sculptures was to design something that would be beautiful without the visual sense. So beautiful to the tactile sense. And that was one of the first exercises. Again, thinking outside of conventions and doing things that were experimental and new.
And I think, if I'm correct, Dove was marketed as a beauty bar. I mean, it was supposed to be this thing that, looks beautiful, makes you beautiful, right?
Yeah. And feels beautiful. And in a way, it is beautiful. The way that it works with the hand, the way that humans and form are working together there is quite extraordinary and simple.
I remember as a kid, my hands were too small to grasp a Dove bar. And it would just shoot out. Yeah, it would just shoot out from and go flying across the tub when I was 4 years old.
Exactly.
I think everybody's got one of those experiences with a Dove bar.
Totally.
What else did you learn about Moholy-Nagy that surprised you in researching his life?
I mean, there are so many things that are surprising about Moholy. I did not realize how much he wrote and published. I mean, he was prolific, not only as a visual maker in everything from like plastic to, he used to bake plexiglass in his oven with his daughters and form it and experiment with this new material, which it was a new material at the time. So his like endless material explorations But also, yeah, the writing. I had not really read his work until I started on this project. And
were these books or articles or?
Both. So, for example, in the 1920s, he this was most likely co-authored by Moholy and his wife at the time, Lucia Moholy. There's an essay called Production Reproduction, and they talk about. Is that
like Conjunction Junction for Schoolhouse Rock? There should be a song.
Yeah, exactly. We could make a production reproduction song.
Yeah.
So but the principle that is explained there is that artists should transform technology. So one of the examples that Moholy uses in the essay is that rather than just playing a phonograph record, one should incise the phonograph record and then play it and hear how it sounds. So he's presaging DJ culture by a few decades.
Yeah, wow.
And in sort of really this principle of experimentation with technology. And one of the films he made was recently rediscovered by the BFI, the British Film Institute. It was lost for a couple of decades, and it's called Sound ABC, or ABC in Sound.
This is Schoolhouse Rock. I'm telling you, there's
except it sounds like harsh experimental noise music from the 90s or something.
Okay.
It's what it is an optical sound film that he drew on the sound film, and so when it runs through the audio player, it plays the drawing. As sound.
Yes.
So really thinking conceptually about what technology can do and how it can create new forms and new sounds and new visuals in the world.
Now, his daughter is still around with us, right?
She is, yes.
That was so cool. I had no idea.
She is an extraordinary person, so smart. And her name is Laszlo Moholy-Nagy. She was born in Germany before her parents left. And he had another daughter, Claudia, who had passed away. But Laszlo is around, and she is the custodian of the estates of both her father and her mother, Sybil Moholy-Nagy, who was a great architectural writer and critic. Yes, she taught for many years at Pratt Institute here in New York.
Yes.
So
I actually knew of her first before I knew about him.
Oh, cool. Yeah. And she was critical of the Bauhaus aesthetic later on, and of Le Corbusier and the Modernists, and sort of really ahead of her time in thinking about how these tower in the park and sort of tabula rasa type of modernist developments were not always in the best interest of the people.
We had a guy on the show who was an Oxford an Oxford professor, a very avowed anti-modernist. Mm-hmm. And he was using Sybil's writing as his justification for why modernism was just a really horrible idea, was destroying society.
I mean, you cannot argue with the fact that there have been some, disasters.
Yeah.
So, and I think Sybil was willing to say that. She was courageous to say that at the time she did. And I think she could understand, partly because she had been immersed in it for a long time, not only in the work, but in the characters.
What was Laszlo's involvement in the Black Mountain experiment in North Carolina? Was he just a lecturer, or was he part of the staff down there?
So Moholy-Nagy was not involved with Black Mountain College.
Okay.
And that was something that we couldn't quite get to the bottom of. It seemed that Moholy-Nagy and Joseph Albers, who was at the helm of Black Mountain College, along with Annie Albers, his wife, that Moholy-Nagy did not have much contact with Joseph Albers. It doesn't seem like there was antagonism or anything like that, but just they were not in communication.
Oh, because
they had mutual friends, obviously, and colleagues.
It seems like there's sort of two sides of the same gang working together, because I know that there were lots of people that went back and forth.
Yes, Bucky Fuller taught at both at the School of Design and at Black Mountain. John Cage did lectures, so there was fluidity for sure. They ran in the same circles, but to my knowledge, Moholy-Nagy did not go to Black Mountain College, and Albers did not come to the School of Design.
Now, did Moholy-Nagy, in his way of teaching, his philosophy, was he one of these guys that wanted you to play a cello and read poems and do painting and, sing? I mean, was he that kind of instructor, or was it something different than that? Like
everyone had to be a Renaissance artist,
right.
A Renaissance person? I don't think so. He wanted people to understand materials and tools The students that we talked to who studied directly with Moholy talked about how he made sure that everyone knew how to use the table saw and the jig, and the women too. It was egalitarian. Everyone had to understand what tools were at their disposal, what technologies were at their disposal, the camera, film. But I don't think he thought that, to my knowledge, he wasn't encouraging people to go home and become piano virtuosos as well. Although some of the students did do, all kinds of things. So.
I was wondering a little bit about the relationship between the new Bauhaus and today's architecture schools, where studios are very much an element of things. But in the old days, old meaning in the 1900s, the architecture students weren't building things as much. They weren't staying up all night in their studios working in balsa wood and tearing things apart and putting them back together. Did the new Bauhaus movement affect the attitude towards construction and actually hands-on?
That's a good question. I think you're getting at art and design education.
Yeah.
Right?
Instead of just being in the classroom studying great buildings and learning how to draw, also using your hands and building things.
Well, yeah. So the German Bauhaus was very much in contrast to the Beaux-Arts model of design and architectural education, both in terms of what the results were and in terms of the processes and the ambiance of the whole place. And Moholy carried that into Chicago for sure. The school, that Marshall Field Mansion was, I think it was probably a mess. Like the photos that we've seen in a good way, like, more like an architecture school today where you see tables and tables of paper models and wood sculptures and metal, all of the kinds of materials that were abstractly put together in experimentation of how Moholy was interested in light as well. So one of the first assignments the students did was a photogram out in the yard. They had to create a photogram, a cyanotype.
Now, what's a photogram? That's different from a photograph.
Photogram is done on printing out paper or just on photo paper, and you expose it to light for a certain amount of time, the paper itself. So it's a photograph without a camera. Oh. It's just photosensitive paper. And so if you're in a dark room, you would put the paper down on the exposure table and you would put objects, like we could put these microphones and this recorder and a hand, and then you have the light on for a certain amount of time. Things that are more transparent will appear gray.
Oh, yeah, right.
Things that are fully opaque would be white, and things that where the light hit it turn totally black. So it's a way of interacting with light and materiality through the photographic process, but without a camera. And Moholy and his first wife, Lucia Moholy, did a lot of this experimentation in the 1920s, and the photograms are something that Moholy did throughout his whole life. But so the arts education, so that's something that has continued in photographic education, in the U.S. in a big way. If you talk to photographers of certain generations, they all made photograms, as part of their education. And that was because Moholy and the instructors who followed him at the School of Design and Institute of Design, Arthur Siegel, Aaron Siskin, Harry Callahan, these giants of photographic education history and photography in the U.S. all continued that kind of model of education, and photograms were part of that understanding of how light interacts in the photographic process.
So who is going to be the Laszlo Moholy-Nagy of 30 years from now? Who's doing the most interesting things now that got your attention?
That is I don't know if I can answer that question. I mean, I think it will be somebody whose name I don't know, but I would say someone who is working at the intersection maybe of like artificial intelligence and art. Maybe virtual reality. Some of my favorite works of art that I've seen in the past few years have been, like when I go to the Sundance Film Festival each year, they have a program called New Frontier, which is all virtual reality and augmented reality projects.
Nice.
And you have these extraordinary sensory experiences where people are really pushing that technology in new directions. And I think somebody, or the next Moholy is probably working in some of those spheres of the latest technology. Which doesn't mean that they're also not painting on the weekends or painting in conjunction with that or whatever. But I think it's always going to be that spirit of Moholy, that kind of pioneering experimental spirit, is somebody who is really who's really pushing the latest technology. I also think that there's another side of him, which is really important, which is the educator. And I think about professors that I had when I was in architecture. I did my MArch at Princeton. And so I studied with like Elizabeth Diller, who designed the High Line and just the new MoMA renovation, Lincoln Center, the Broad Museum. Anyway, studying with her was really eye-opening because she was always pushing, questioning what is architecture? How can we use the latest technologies in ways that are interesting and experimental? So I think there are educators out there who are really challenging young people to think for themselves and who really see their students as whole people, because I think that's something Moholy truly believed, that like one of his other quotes that I love is, not the product, but the person is the end in view.
Nice.
And I think he meant that not just in terms of the user of the product, like the user of the Dove soap bar is more important than the Dove soap bar, let's say, or it's at that nexus between the user and the product where the designer needs to operate. I also think he meant it in terms of the designer or the artist or the architect, that the making of the work is the making of ourselves. And that's something that's been really important to me as a filmmaker. Every project I do, it changes me. It becomes part of my life. Whether it's the people like Laszlo Moholy-Nagy, who I hope to, have in my life for as long as I can and continue to learn from, or my first film about 3 architects in Cuba who made
Unfinished Spaces.
Unfinished Spaces, exactly. So those architects...
2012.
Yeah. Those architects, Riccardo Porro, Vittorio Garatti, and Roberto Gottardi, were incredibly influential for me and for everyone who saw that film. So I just think the making of the work is the making of ourselves and our world. And so whoever's engaged with that kind of thinking, I think, is going to be the next Moholy.
Well, the film is The New Bauhaus. And is there a website people can go see the trailer?
There is a website. It's thenewbauhaus.com.
Okay.
And that will definitely, the trailer will be there when it's ready.
Okay.
But we're still working on that. Tonight is actually the world premiere, the first time we're sharing the film with an audience in a theater.
Excellent.
And tomorrow night is in Chicago at the Chicago International Film Festival, and many, many more to come. So I hope everyone does check out thenewbauhaus.com. I'm also on Twitter at Alysa Nahmias, and I hope everyone enjoys it.
So as an independent filmmaker, are there plans for this film to be on YouTube or Amazon one day where people can buy it or rent it or somehow have it in their homes?
For sure. Yeah.
How long does that take from the time you premiere a film until the time somebody can be watching it on their own TV?
That's different for every film. And I think with this one, we're definitely going to do a few months of festivals and special screenings, community screenings, academic museum screenings. So if folks want to see the film before it's out and digitally, they can contact us at thenewbauhaus.com. But first, I would say contact your local university or library or Doco Momo or the American Institute of Architects, some organization that might sponsor a community screening.
Or U.S. Modernist. We'll do it.
Exactly. Oh, great. Let's do it. So yeah, with U.S. Modernist, we could organize, regional screenings and do a kind of tour. And I think that those sorts of things can happen very quickly.
Well, thank you so much for spending time with me here in the dark.
Thanks,
in the
George.
Cineopolis Theater in New York City.
Thank you so much for having me.
Coming up, George talks with Akira Boch of Masters of Modern Design. But first, in an adventure we are largely making up, modernist realtor Angela Roll dated Harry Potter at age 17 as she attended Le Corbusier High School, just down the road from Hogwarts. They never played each other in soccer, but their proms were legendary, particularly the year they did Stairway to Heaven. Although ridiculed by other architecture students for dating a magician, she learned how to conjure up the slightly tipsy ghost of Mies van der Rohe, and she aced all the exams. Now she specializes in modernist houses and uses her architecture training, which is a real thing, unlike magic, to advise buyers and sellers on the best strategies for preserving the architecture they love, and what dress to wear to a Hogwarts prom. Hint, not an invisibility cloak. Angela Roll is your special agent. Reach her at angelaroll.com. That's ROEHL or 919-995-0550. We go now to George and Akira Boch, director of the Media Arts Center at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles.
I was fascinated by your film, and it drove me to do some more research on my own. Do you agree that most Americans are just not aware of the Japanese internment experience?
That's a really good question, because living on the West Coast, I feel like most people do know about it. So I'd actually like to ask you that question. How familiar were you with that history?
Well, I knew about it through George Matsumoto, who is our heralded son in North Carolina, who was an architect, very famous in our state, and then moved out to Oakland. And he was in one of the camps and tells his story. We have some video of him, in fact, on our site. So I knew about it through that. But most of the people I know and most of the people that I run into have never heard about it. We're just completely unaware that this existed, that the government put these things in place, and that it took, several decades for the case to come to court for any kind of reparations for that? During the Clinton administration, I think that happened.
Well, it was actually during the Reagan administration.
Reagan, okay.
Yeah. But at the time, there were several Japanese American congressmen and Senator Dan Inouye
of Hawaii,
who basically took up the cause of a grassroots movement, right? So it was people on the ground that were pushing for some kind of reparations or even just an apology. And of course, because most of these Japanese American Congress people had experienced it themselves, they were on board, but they knew that it had to go through a very lengthy process, right? So it took many years for them to actually get the bill pushed through and then have Reagan finally sign it.
And describe for our listeners what Roosevelt signed into law that made these camps happen.
Yeah, so that was Executive Order 9066. And that was basically a move that Roosevelt made. I feel that was out of pressure that he was receiving from lobbyists on the West Coast, in particular California, different politicians, and especially agribusiness people that were wanting the removal of the Japanese from the West Coast.
And why?
Because they wanted their land, of course.
Okay.
Right?
And they were using the excuse that they were all spies? Was that the idea?
Yeah. Of course, many of them thought that they were a threat, but there was ultimately no proof of any sort of wrongdoing by any of the Japanese American population. So, yes, it was largely a land grab.
So did they lose their property rights from this?
Well, see, the thing is that most Japanese Americans, about 2/3 that were farming at the time, they were not able to own their land because they weren't U.S. citizens, right? Okay. So they leased their land. And those that did mainly were able to purchase their land through their children, right? So they had small children, 8, 9, 10 years old, and they would put the land in their name. So those people were able to own their land. And like, for example, in the case of my family, both of my grandparents were farmers and they were born in Hawaii. So that made them U.S. nationals. So once they came over, they were actually able to purchase the land. But that's actually one of the major reasons why many Japanese Americans did not return to the West Coast, because they had nothing to return to. And
this went on for how long? I mean, it was not just a short time, it was years.
Yes, the internment experience went on from 1942 all the way through pretty much the end of 1945. It was after the war. They officially closed the camps around the middle of 1945, but many people decided to stay on longer because they didn't know where to go. Mm. So, they weren't really able to make money during the war. Many people actually worked at the camps and they were paid small amounts of money. But once they left the camps, they were given basically $25 and a train ticket.
This is horrible. I mean, it's just unbelievably horrible.
Yeah, it was it was one of the greatest crimes that the American government has ever committed.
And your film covers several people who, out of this experience and other experiences, went on to contribute in incredible ways to art and architecture. So I want to hear about those people.
Sure. Let's see. Where should we start? Who do you want to start with?
Let's start with Nakashima.
Okay. So George Nakashima was already, I believe, in his early 40s when he went into camp. So he had a very strong background in architecture and design, and he had started making furniture before going into camp. But once he got there, he met a fellow woodworker that was actually a Japanese immigrant from the Shikoku island of Japan. And his name was Gentaro Hikogawa. And he is the one that really taught George how to work with found materials, and he taught him Japanese woodworking techniques. So George really considered this period of time a mentorship with Hikogawa. And once he got out, he put those skills to use. And I think it took him a few years, a little while, to get back on his feet and actually start making the furniture that he's known for now. But he really took what he learned from that camp experience and applied it to his later work, which he's now really famous for.
In the film, you make a point several times of showing how people really tried to make the best of it from that experience and grow from that and teach themselves things and use that as a springboard to their later careers.
Yes. Yeah, so most of the artists that we deal with in the film were relatively young. They were either in their later high school years or early 20s. And, when you're young like that, you have your whole life ahead of you. You have a lot of optimism, right? And so, of course, they were going to use their time as best they could. On the other hand, their parents, the Issei, who were much older, like in their 40s and 50s, like some in their 60s, they had already kind of passed their prime working years. So they were essentially taken away from their jobs, their livelihoods, and so they had less to look forward to, and sort of, I guess, less pushing them to improve their lot in life and, learn new things. But that's why the younger people actively sought out different skills and techniques or whatever that they could find in the camps and apply it to their own lives and their practices.
Out of all the people that you profiled in the film, one's still living, right?
Yes, Gyo Obata is still alive, and he's living in St. Louis. He's quite a famous architect. And so I work at the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles, and he is the one that designed that building. And it's really a showcase for everything that he had learned beforehand, because he has a very sort of long and interesting story, too. He grew up in Berkeley. His father was an amazing artist. His name was Gyo Obata, and he was an Issei, a first-generation immigrant from Japan. And the elder Obata ended up teaching at Berkeley in the art department. And so he was, to be Japanese at that time and teaching at a major university like that was such a rarity, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
I don't know of any other cases of that. So the younger Obata, Gyo, was always surrounded by Japanese art, right? Because not only was his father a great painter, but his mother was also an ikebana artist, which, do you know what that is?
No, I don't.
Okay, so that's basically the art of flower arrangement, right? So they would take these vases and find different kinds of natural materials and create these really beautiful floral designs. She was actually one of the first people to bring ikebana to the United States. Gyo was constantly surrounded by this beautiful artwork.
Art and design and nature.
Yes. Nature was a huge influence on him because the elder Gyo Obata loved nature. He did countless pieces out in Yosemite and Mono Lake, like all over California. He did woodblock prints of, different landscapes. So he became really well known for that. He would take the family camping for like months at a time. So Gyo really sort of absorbed his father's love of nature also.
Now, he was the O in HOK, right?
Yes.
Which is one of the biggest, most well-known firms ever in history.
Yes. They, I believe, were one of the first firms to find different partners, the H and the O and the K, who were all interested in different aspects of building this company. So one was really into production, one was really into marketing, and Obata was the designer, right? So they all sort of fulfilled his design ideas and ambitions. And so that's why he considered it a perfect situation, because he could do exactly what he wanted to do, which was just design, and let his partners take care of the other aspects. But they all had training in architecture, and, they all knew exactly what they were doing. And they just managed to take off by, they diversified their practice. They did everything from schools to prisons to whatever sort
embassies.
Any sort of government jobs, they would take them to build their resume to the point where they could do these other jobs where Gyo could really sort of flex his design muscles.
And previously, if I'm correct, he was partners with Minoru Yamasaki?
Yes, Gyo worked for Yamasaki.
Okay.
So Yamasaki was one of Gyo's big mentors, really. And Yamasaki, at a certain point, opened an office in St. Louis. And that's when he brought in Gyo, to start up that office. And what happened was Yamasaki had really bad ulcers. So he decided to close that office. And at that point, Gyo and his partners decided to go off on their own. Mm-hmm. And that's when they started to take off.
Okay. And HOK, what are some of the buildings people might recognize that they did?
Let's see. They did the Busch Stadium in
St. Louis.
St. Louis. They did many different sites around St. Louis because that's where they're based. But they also did many sites on the West Coast, like the Levi's building in San Francisco, the Federal building in Minneapolis. They're really worldwide.
Lots of skyscrapers and some airports, I believe.
Yes.
Too.
Airports in Sendai, also Saudi Arabia. They're just a huge global firm. At this point, because Gyo's retired, I'm not sure exactly what their status is, but for a long time, they were really the largest architectural firm in the world.
Incredible success. Incredible success. Do you know if Gyo was involved with the monument in Washington, D.C.? There's a monument for all the interned Japanese Americans in D.C.
I don't know. I actually am not even familiar with the monument that you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I hadn't heard that he was involved in making that.
If you're in Washington, D.C., you can look up the Japanese American Monument, which, as I recall, has the names of all the camps around the base of it, for all around the country, because they were not just in California, they were throughout the Southwest, and I think there was at least a couple in the East.
Yeah, there was only one in California, which was Manzanar, and then the rest were all in the other western states, like Colorado, Utah, Arkansas had 2 camps, Wyoming had a camp, Heart Mountain, Idaho. So primarily the western states.
One of the other people that you profiled was Ruth Asawa, who I thought was fascinating.
Yes, Ruth is really amazing. Actually, because we went to the Guggenheim yesterday, near the top floor, there are 2 Ruth Asawa pieces, and I was happy to see them. The other sort of ironic thing is that there was a children's book in their bookstore, and I started looking through it, and I was kind of shocked because it completely left out her camp experience.
Really?
Yes, which was a major influence on her as an artist. So let's see, where should we start with Ruth?
Wherever you like.
Okay. So Ruth grew up on a farm in Norwalk, California. And that's really where she started to kind of pay attention to nature, right? Nature was also a major influence on her work. And once the war broke out and the camps were opened, she was sent to Arkansas. And along the way, she was able to study with 3 Disney animators who were also Japanese American and who were also interned, and they decided to basically create an art school. And so this is where Ruth says that she really started to learn how to draw by these young professionals. So I think possibly they helped open up her eyes to the possibilities of what she could do as an artist, not necessarily animation, but to use that skill in a professional way. So once she was able to leave the camp, she went to a teacher's college out in Wisconsin because she was basically told that she needed to find some kind of practical career, right? And teaching is a very safe and practical career.
Sure.
So
That's what they tell all artists, right? You have to have a fallback career.
You need to make money somehow, right? And so she went ahead and did that. But once she graduated, they would not place her in a classroom. And there are sort of conflicting reports as to why. Like, on one side, the claim is that they were doing it to protect her because they didn't know what would happen if they put a Japanese American teacher into a classroom. And on the other hand, it was just seen as an outright act of discrimination against her. So at the time, she had a couple of friends that were really interested in Black Mountain College in
North Carolina. Yep.
Yes, Asheville, North Carolina. So she decided she had nothing to lose, and she just went for it. And she moved out to Black Mountain, and it was really a transformational experience for her. That was where she basically came under the tutelage of Joseph Albers and so many other young artists at the time that eventually became really huge within, the American art scene.
And her work is all over the world now.
Yes, it's all over the world. It's a really amazing story because she had been making these wire sculptures for decades, and they did really well when she first started to show them, like back in the 50s, right? Like even the Rockefellers collected them. But because she lived in San Francisco, she was kind of seen as an outsider to the overall art scene. And she also had 6 kids. She was doing other things. She was very involved in the school system, trying to get art into schools in San Francisco. And so she kind of fell off the radar for quite a while. Not completely, people still knew who she was, and she was still, very active as an artist, doing like a lot of different public sculptures and that kind of thing. And it wasn't until kind of recently, like within the last decade, that her wire sculptures were really rediscovered. And at a certain point, one of them went on auction and sold for way more than she ever dreamed, that one of her works could sell for. And
holy cow, yeah. How much was it? Do you remember?
I believe it was like $1.4 million. Wow. Something like that.
Yeah.
And so at the time, Ruth was not doing well health-wise. And so, I believe it was when her daughters told her what the piece sold for, she was in total shock, right? And that was just one piece. And they had, I believe, literally hundreds of pieces at her home, right? Because her home was just sort of this nest of wire sculptures.
Yeah, just a temple of them, really.
Yeah.
All over the place.
Yeah. And so I believe since then, her work has just continued to grow in value and popularity. I think more and more people are learning about her story and are really impressed by her, not only as an artist, but also what she did for the San Francisco school system.
This project, I understand, came out of an article by Alexander Lang in January of 2017 on the anniversary of Executive Order 9066, prompted by an exhibition at the Noguchi Museum on internment.
Yes.
The film is called Masters of Modern Design, The Art of the Japanese-American Experience. Is there a website for the film currently?
Yes. Actually, you can stream the film online. This film was a co-production between KCET, which is the Los Angeles PBS affiliate, and the Japanese American National Museum, the Watase Media Arts Center. And the film can be found on KCET's website. So if you just go to kcet.org/artbound, you will find it there.
Well, Kira, thanks for dropping by. It's been nice to talk to you.
Same here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening. I'm Tom Guild. U.S. Modernist Radio is underwritten by Angela Roll, your special real estate agent for modernist houses, and by Nichiha.com/US Modernist. Visit usmodernist.org's massive modernist archives to hear past shows, discover 7,000 mid-century houses, and access 2.7 million pages of classic 20th century architecture magazines. Contact George at usmodernist.org or on Instagram at Mr.Modernism. U.S. Modernist Radio is produced by Soundtracks Recording Studios in Raleigh, North Carolina. Our theme song was performed by George Smart and Robinson Earl. You'll never get to meet guest researcher Cindy Stratton.
Not her real name.
As she's just moved to an even more secret underground hideaway.
Don't tell anyone.
With its own cloaking device and lasers.
Lasers.
U.S. Modernist Radio is a production of Modernist Archive, a nonprofit educational archive for the documentation, preservation, and promotion of modernist residential design. George and I'll be back soon with another breathlessly cinematic PG-13 rated, woefully underfunded edition of U.S. Modernist Radio.